Hello, and thanks for stopping by. This statue, standing at the heart of Islington Green, depicts a fellow named Sir Hugh Myddelton. Myddelton in this case being spelled Myddelton, a Welshman born in 1560 who did great things for London. For in the early 17th century, Myddelton helped finance the New River, an ambitious project that brought clean drinking water into the city from the Hertfordshire countryside. The story of the New River is worthy of a video in its own right, and indeed I may well cover it at some point. But for today, we're going to be focusing on the area around which it originally terminated, that being a spot just south of here called New River Head in Clerkenwell, next door to Sadler's Wells Theatre on Rosebery Avenue. Just behind here is Myddelton Square, which, as I'm sure you've already guessed, is named after Sir Hugh Myddelton, as is Myddelton Passage, which connects Myddelton Square to Arlington Way. Looking at it today, Myddelton Passage is a pleasant, unassuming residential street. But looks can be deceiving, for in years gone by, this little backwater had a fearsome reputation. So much so that it was widely considered to be one of the capital's most dangerous thoroughfares. And what's this all about? If you look closely at the early 19th century brick wall, which runs along the southern edge of Myddelton Passage, you'll notice it's covered in hundreds of seemingly random numbers and initials, which have been scratched into the brickwork, a form of Victorian graffiti tagging, if you will. And believe it or not, one of them has a loose and rather bizarre connection to the Jack the Ripper case. We'll get to the carvings and who made them later, but first, let's examine what made Myddelton Passage so notorious in the first place. As with its name, Myddelton Passage owes its existence to the creation of the New River, which, as we saw earlier, once terminated close to here, just off of Rosebery Avenue. Back in 1613, when the New River first reached this spot, the land between Islington and Clerkenwell was distinctly rural, perched on what was then the outskirts of London. However, partly thanks to the arrival of the New River, things soon began to develop. The New River Company, who owned the waterway, established their headquarters here, and spreading out from the initial reservoir, known as the Round Pond, a complex of other facilities began to appear, including extra reservoirs, filter beds, a windmill and so on. You can still see buildings related to water infrastructure dotted around the site. In those early days, the northern perimeter of the New River Company site backed onto fields and was protected by a wooden fence, as seen in this illustration from around 1740. As the area developed further into the early 19th century, with streets and housing developments beginning to spring up, this fence was replaced with the tall brick wall we see today. A similar wall, now long vanished, which backed onto the gardens of houses on Myddelton Square, was also added along the northern edge, thus creating a long, narrow alley. Myddelton Passage. It's difficult to appreciate just how cramped Myddelton Passage used to be, although you can gain some idea from this aerial photograph taken in the 1940s. In the 19th century, this part of London could be pretty rowdy, not helped by the fact that the former Deacon's Music Hall was also located here, just opposite Arlington Way. The presence of the music hall, which also included an attached pub called the Sir Hugh Myddelton, meant there was no shortage of drunks staggering home late at night, many of whom would be drawn towards Myddelton Passage in search of a punch-up. Robbery was a common crime on Myddelton Passage, as were offences of, shall we say, a more seedy nature, such as the case of William Walters, who in 1877 was imprisoned for disgraceful conduct at Myddelton Passage, although what exactly that disgraceful conduct was is left to our imagination. There were far more serious crimes associated with Myddelton Passage though, namely murder and attempted murder. One attempted murder occurred here on the night of the 23rd of October 1897, when 3 youths, Thomas Young, Thomas Tall and Michael Small, surrounded Police Constable Collins in Myddelton Passage after he attempted to intervene in a scuffle. As PC Collins grappled with the troublemakers, Thomas Young lashed out with a dagger, stabbing the policeman in several places with an 8-inch blade, which was later tossed onto the bank of the New River. In court, it was revealed the 3 men were known members of a gang of young fellows who frequented Clerkenwell for the purpose of fomenting street fights. They armed themselves with knives and revolvers and weapons of that kind, with which they paraded the streets of the neighbourhood. Not much different to gang mentality today really, is it? Fortunately, PC Collins survived, and the 3 ne'er-do-wells who'd attacked him were sentenced to prison with hard labour. Another assault on a police officer occurred in Myddelton Passage the following year, when a drunk carpenter named Jack Jones punched a bobby in the chest, threw him to the ground, and proceeded to kick him as he lay crumpled on the floor. Although police officers often found themselves the target of violence on Myddelton Passage, a murder occurred here at the turn of the 20th century, in which a law enforcer themselves was the culprit. The incident in question took place on the night of October 6, 1903, when a former Metropolitan Police detective named William James used a key to access a door on Myddelton Passage which backed into the garden of 19 Myddelton Square, a property in which he used to live with his wife and 3 stepdaughters until the relationship broke down. Once in the garden, James slipped into the house through a basement window. Then, once inside, and without a word, he fired a revolver at his stepdaughter Florence and sister-in-law Dorcas Pfizer. Florence survived, although sadly Dorcas died whilst being rushed to hospital. Tried at the Old Bailey the following month, William James was found guilty of manslaughter, his only apparent excuse being that his manner of late had been strange, and he was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Given its notoriety, it's perhaps no surprise that Myddelton Passage made a literary appearance in the Victorian era, that being in George Gissing's The Netherworld, a novel published in 1889 which detailed the lives of several families living in London slums. In chapter 8 of the book, a character named Pennyloaf Candy, you don't get names like that anymore, do you, heads to Myddelton Passage to meet a fellow named Bob Hewlett. Myddelton Passage, George Gissing tells us, is a narrow paved walk between brick walls 7 feet high. On the one hand lies the new riverhead, on the other are small gardens behind Myddelton Square. The branches of a few trees hang over. There are doors seemingly never opened, and a couple of gas lamps shed feeble light. The reader is then told that Pennyloaf paced the length of the passage several times, meeting no one. Then a policeman came along with echoing tread and eyed her suspiciously. The bobby moves on, which is unfortunate because sometime later another woman named Clem Peckover turns up. Clem is Pennyloaf's rival, and the two become embroiled in a vicious fight, with Pennyloaf being slammed against a wall. Just another normal night on Myddelton Passage, it would seem. The mention of a policeman patrolling Myddelton Passage in the Netherworld brings us now to these mysterious markings which feature along the southern wall. For many years, it was believed these marks were prison numbers, made by Napoleonic prisoners of war, which is a fair assumption, as the wall does indeed date from that era, and some POWs did work on certain construction sites. However, more recent research by historians has determined that these are in fact police collar numbers, which were scratched into the wall by patrolling constables, mostly those from Finsbury Division, denoted by a G at the end of each number, who operated out of this former police station on nearby King's Cross Road. The reason why so many bobbies chose to record their marks here has been long lost to time. However, as seen in the Netherworld, and with the real-life reports mentioned earlier, in which policemen were physically attacked, police maintained a regular watch on Myddelton Passage, and so, on the quieter occasions when things weren't kicking off along here, it's probably safe to assume that they took to carving the brickwork out of boredom. Maybe one or two officers started it, with others following suit, thus establishing an unofficial tradition. It's also worth noting that the marks are mainly to be found in the middle section of the wall. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe it's because that's where the bobbies were expected to stand, thus giving them command over both ends of the alley. I imagine they scratched their names into the opposite wall too, which is sadly long gone. One of the most intriguing marks is this one, made by someone called Robinson, who is believed to have been Detective Sergeant Robinson, a fellow who holds a curious place in Jack the Ripper lore. His story is detailed in this article from the 3rd of November 1888, in which the detective, along with a colleague named Henry Doncaster, observed a strange fellow, supposed to be Jack the Ripper, enter the yard of a cab depot located on Phoenix Place, roughly a quarter of a mile south of Myddelton Passage, late one night. Hot on this mysterious stranger's trail, Robinson borrowed a woman's cloak and hat, goodness knows where from, given how late it was, thus disguising himself in female attire. He then snuck into the yard and hid behind a row of parked up cabs, although he clearly wasn't very good at hide and seek, as he was soon spotted by a group of the yard's employees, who came over to demand what was going on. Robinson lifted his cap, revealing he was a chap, stated that he was a detective, and told the men to be quiet, which they didn't take very kindly to. A scuffle broke out, which rapidly escalated, leading to Detective Robinson being stabbed by one of the men, an individual named William Jarvis. Fortunately, the bumbling detective survived, and Jarvis, having been recommended to mercy, got off lightly with a 6-week prison sentence. Back at Myddelton Passage, it would appear things began to calm down here in the 20th century, and at some point, around the time of the Second World War, the alley was significantly widened, creating the more open path we see today. However, that's not to say the street's menacing air completely went away. On the 19th of June 1961, a murder occurred here when Albert Weston strangled his wife Ellen to death at their home in Worthington House on the eastern end of Myddelton Passage. Rather bizarrely, the defence offered by Weston at the Old Bailey was that during the murder, he lost complete control of his body, behaving like an automaton, and was unable to comprehend what his mind or hands were doing. The jury didn't buy it, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The last major incident to occur here took place over the course of late October and early November 1977, when a Myddelton Passage resident, a middle-aged accountant named Stuart Brickle, didn't take too kindly to a group of bailiffs showing up at his door. They'd been given orders to evict him so that the council could carry out work on the property, which, according to one report, Brickle paid £13 a week rent for. Blimey, imagine that in Clerkenwell nowadays. Brickle refused to budge, saying he wouldn't move until the council offered him alternative accommodation, which, to be honest, I don't think is that unreasonable, although I'm not condoning what happened next. As the situation escalated, police turned up to assist the bailiffs, which led Brickle to lash out with a machete, striking several of his antagonisers. He then quickly barricaded himself into the second floor flat and threatened to set off makeshift explosives, which later turned out to be duds. For the next 10 days, Myddelton Passage lay under siege, with 30 police officers camped outside as Brickle lorded over his makeshift fort. The lengthy standoff finally ended when police took advantage of Brickle's exhausted state, he'd barely slept or eaten in 10 days, by rushing his door. Stuart Brickle was later sentenced to 5 years in prison. Thankfully, things seem a lot calmer on Myddelton Passage nowadays, with the policeman's carvings offering the only hint of its darker past. But having said that, you never know what lies just around the corner, do you? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at Myddelton Passage, and as always, I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Is it a place you were aware of? And are there any other similar little streets which you'd like me to cover on the channel? If so, please be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.